Coal Dynamics Tower stood like a steel and glass monument in the heart of the city, its reflective windows catching the morning sun in dazzling fragments. To outsiders, the building was a symbol of power, precision, and unshakable wealth. Inside, however, chaos simmered beneath the polished marble floors and spotless boardroom tables. The company, one of the most prestigious corporations in the country, was on the verge of disaster. At the helm was Ethan Cole, a self-made millionaire whose name carried weight in both business and philanthropy. His sharp decisions and fearless investments had turned Coal Dynamics into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But now, Ethan's empire was crumbling under the weight of a single problem, one that money, influence, and expertise had so far failed to solve. The issue began quietly, like a small crack in an otherwise flawless mirror. A crucial project, the company's most ambitious and lucrative contract to date, had hit an unexpected roadblock. The system at the center of the project, a sophisticated piece of technology designed to revolutionize client operations, was malfunctioning. Not in obvious ways that a technician could patch up, but in subtle, unpredictable bursts. A line of code that refused to cooperate. A mechanism that worked perfectly in tests but failed spectacularly in live conditions. A system that, if not fixed, would result in millions in losses, broken contracts, and public humiliation. The stakes were brutal. A looming deadline threatened the company's credibility. Shareholders were restless, whispering doubts into one another's ears. Competitors were circling like vultures, ready to seize any opportunity to bring down Coal Dynamics. Worst of all, the media had caught wind of trouble behind the tower walls, and stories speculating on Ethan's failure were already brewing. In response, Ethan had done what any sensible leader with unlimited resources would do. He had summoned the best. Over the course of 2 months, 20 different experts had walked through the glass doors of Coal Dynamics Tower. They came armed with credentials, experience, and egos to match. The first was a renowned systems engineer, celebrated for saving Fortune 500 companies from technical ruin. He left after 3 days, muttering about unsolvable integration flaws. Then came a data analyst, a cybersecurity guru, an MIT professor, and even a retired government contractor known for solving classified problems in defense projects. Each promised results. Each left defeated. The parade of failures grew almost comical in its tragedy. Consultants billed Ethan astronomical fees, running complex simulations and producing endless reports, but the problem only grew more stubborn. Some insisted the entire system should be scrapped and rebuilt, an idea that would cost Ethan not just millions but his reputation. Others claimed the issue was a ghost in the machine, something no one could trace. Ethan watched them all, his patience thinning with every passing day. His office, usually a place of calm command, became a revolving door of disappointment. He could see the weight of the situation in the weary eyes of his team. Every failure etched deeper lines into his own face. And then came the breaking point. The 20th expert, a celebrated international consultant, threw his hands up after a week of probing. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice strained with frustration, "sometimes problems cannot be solved. This is one of them." He left behind nothing but an invoice with too many zeros and an air of finality that crushed the last shreds of optimism in the room. The company that prided itself on brilliance had been brought to its knees. Money had been poured in like water into a bottomless pit. Time, the most precious commodity, was bleeding away faster than Ethan could stop it. But fate has a strange sense of irony. Where 20 experts had failed, the solution would not come from the high towers of academia or the polished resumes of industry leaders. It would not come from someone with degrees, accolades, or a consulting fee. The answer was about to walk in, quietly and invisibly, wearing the uniform of someone no one noticed. A poor cleaning lady, broom in hand, would soon solve in 1 minute what the greatest minds could not. And in that moment, Ethan Cole's world, and the meaning of genius, would be forever changed. Ethan Cole's name was spoken in boardrooms and business schools with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. By the age of 40, he had risen from a modest upbringing to become one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the country. His company, Coal Dynamics, was a juggernaut in technology and innovation, partnering with governments, hospitals, and corporations to provide solutions that shaped industries. Newspapers hailed him as a visionary. Magazines called him the golden boy of business. His story was splashed across the covers with words like relentless, brilliant, and unstoppable. But Ethan himself rarely smiled at those headlines. To him, success was not a trophy, it was an obligation. Raised in a working-class neighborhood, Ethan had clawed his way upward, armed with nothing but an instinct for opportunity and a work ethic that bordered on obsession. He spent long nights studying markets, designing prototypes, and courting investors who laughed at his youth. Over time, persistence won, and those who had once mocked him now begged for a place at his table. Yet, the higher he climbed, the more precarious the peak became. The boardroom of Coal Dynamics Tower reflected Ethan's journey: sleek, immaculate, intimidating. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the skyline. Yet Ethan often felt as though the glass didn't open outward, but inward, trapping him in an aquarium where everyone could see him, but no one could touch him. He was admired, envied, even feared. But he was not understood. Ethan's daily schedule was a testament to discipline. He arrived at dawn, long before his executives shuffled in, and stayed late into the night when the cleaners moved silently through the halls. He believed that presence was power. To shareholders, he was the immovable figure at the helm, the man who never faltered, never wavered. To the public, he was the charismatic face of progress, speaking at conferences, shaking hands with leaders, and cutting ribbons on billion-dollar projects. But beneath the polished exterior, pressure was eating away at him. The recent crisis, the project that had swallowed millions in investment and months of time, was more than just a technical hiccup. It was a potential death sentence for his credibility. Shareholders had started sending not-so-subtle warnings: find a solution or prepare for consequences. Investors, once warm and loyal, now questioned whether Ethan had lost his edge. Rumors spread that perhaps Coal Dynamics was stretched too thin, or worse, that Ethan himself was no longer the visionary they once believed in. Each failed expert was like a nail driven deeper into Ethan's patience. He had spared no expense, flying in talent from across the globe, housing them in luxury suites, feeding them every resource they demanded. But one after another, they left with excuses, theories, and failure. Ethan would sit in his office after each departure, staring at the city lights outside his window. A man who had built his fortune on control now found himself powerless. Frustration boiled beneath his calm demeanor. His assistants knew when to step lightly, recognizing the clenched jaw, the terse replies, the silence that followed bad news. Yet he never raised his voice in public. He had mastered the art of stoicism. His fury was quieter, colder, a storm that built pressure until it threatened to shatter him from within. In the privacy of his penthouse, Ethan sometimes allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. Surrounded by marble floors and priceless art, he felt the weight of emptiness. He had colleagues, advisors, and employees, but no one he could confide in. Conversations revolved around strategy, profits, and deadlines. Rarely did anyone ask how he was, or if he ever felt tired. Success had given him power, but it had stolen intimacy. He was a man encircled by people yet profoundly alone. That loneliness sharpened the sting of failure. The expert's incompetence wasn't just costing him money, it was underscoring the void in his life. If even the brightest minds couldn't help him, who could? He poured another glass of whiskey late at night, staring at the city below, the amber liquid catching the reflection of the skyline. In those quiet hours, he realized the paradox of his existence. He could buy anything, except certainty, peace, or trust. Still, Ethan was not one to surrender. His entire life had been a fight against the odds, and this would be no different. If it took another 20 experts, he would hire them. If it required doubling the budget, he would sign the check without hesitation. He was prepared to burn money like firewood if that's what it took to keep the flame of his empire alive. And yet, a whisper of doubt lingered. What if this truly was a problem that money couldn't solve? What if, for the first time in his career, Ethan Cole had met a wall he could not break through? The thought was intolerable, but it hung in the air like a shadow. In the days that followed, as failure after failure piled up, Ethan's frustration hardened into resolve. He promised himself he would not rest until the problem was destroyed, no matter the cost. He didn't know it yet, but the solution would come not from the expensive boardrooms or the renowned experts he trusted, but from a source so unexpected it would upend his understanding of value itself. It would come from someone who cost him nothing, someone invisible in the very building he commanded. A cleaning lady with no credentials, no investors, and no reputation. Only a sharp mind and a lifetime of overlooked wisdom. For now, though, Ethan remained in the storm of pressure, blind to the irony that salvation was sweeping the floors just outside his office door. The conference room of Coal Dynamics had become a stage for failure. What was once the pride of the company, a space designed for innovation, strategy, and bold decisions, was now a revolving door of so-called saviors who promised miracles and delivered nothing. The first expert had been a world-renowned IT guru, flown in from Silicon Valley. His arrival came with fanfare, articles praising Ethan's decisiveness and employees whispering that the crisis would soon be over. The man spoke in jargon so dense that half the room struggled to follow, tossing acronyms like confetti. He brought an entourage of assistants and computers, claiming that with enough data modeling, he could pinpoint the flaw. 3 days later, he admitted defeat, mumbling something about untraceable anomalies, before disappearing with his 6-figure paycheck. Next came a mechanical engineer with decades of experience. He was blunt, confident, and carried himself as though the problem was already solved. He dismantled parts of the system, rebuilt components, and drew elaborate blueprints across the boardroom walls. But each test ended in the same humiliating malfunction. His final words to Ethan were, "It shouldn't be doing this, it makes no sense." He, too, left with nothing but excuses. By the time the third and fourth experts came, mathematicians from a prestigious European university, Ethan's patience was already thinning. They filled the whiteboards with equations that looked like they belonged in a physics textbook rather than a corporate setting. For a week, they calculated probabilities, risk models, and failure patterns. Their conclusion? Statistically, this issue shouldn't exist. A statement that only deepened Ethan's fury. The fifth expert, a business analyst, insisted the problem wasn't technical at all but operational. He conducted interviews, produced charts, and suggested an overhaul of entire departments. Employees resented him, and his suggestions only created more confusion. Ethan dismissed him after realizing the man was more interested in reorganizing the company than solving the actual issue. As the weeks stretched on, the parade of experts grew both diverse and desperate. A cybersecurity specialist from Washington claimed the system had been hacked by competitors. He combed through every firewall, every line of code, and found nothing. Red-faced, he admitted that the system was clean. A government contractor boasted about solving problems far beyond the civilian world. He spent days whispering about classified strategies, but achieved nothing. A tech startup founder, barely in his 30s, strutted in with arrogance. He bragged that his disruptive methods had revolutionized industries. After a week of posturing, his theories collapsed, and he stormed out, blaming Ethan's staff for not being visionary enough. Not all failures were loud. Some experts were simply broken by the task. A middle-aged systems architect, once hailed as a genius, spent nights in the building hunched over his laptop. By the end of his week, his eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking. "I don't understand it," he whispered before resigning. His desperation left a heavy silence in the room. With each failure, Ethan's anger grew colder. He stopped listening to their boasts and promises. He sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, watching with sharp eyes as one after another tried, and failed, to tame the beast of the project. The 15th expert nearly broke him. She was a highly decorated engineer who arrived with television cameras in tow, ready to showcase her brilliance. She conducted tests while reporters snapped photos, her confidence lighting up the room. But when the system failed again in front of the cameras, her face drained of color. The story made headlines, "Even the best can't fix Coal Dynamics crisis." Ethan's humiliation was now public. By the time the 20th expert arrived, the atmosphere inside Coal Dynamics was one of resignation. Employees whispered in the halls, avoiding eye contact with Ethan. The board began to pressure him openly. "How long can this go on?" one member demanded. The final expert was perhaps the most arrogant of all. An international consultant with a reputation for being a last resort, he arrived with an inflated fee and a confidence that bordered on insult. For a week he tinkered, analyzed, and delivered daily updates that sounded impressive but meant nothing. On the last day, he slammed his pen onto the table and said, "Mr. Cole, sometimes problems simply don't have solutions. This is one of them." His words cut deeper than any failure before. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He watched the man leave, another fortune wasted, another scar on his company's pride. The failures left behind more than just wasted money. They created an atmosphere of hopelessness that seeped into every corner of the building. Employees began to wonder if the project was cursed. Some whispered about quitting before the company collapsed. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt the weight of true helplessness pressing down on his shoulders. But fate is often cruel in its humor. 20 experts, armed with degrees, titles, and accolades, had all failed. They wielded complexity like a weapon, drowning the problem in theories and tools that only clouded the truth. Not one of them considered that perhaps the answer was simpler, painfully, embarrassingly simple. It was this oversight that would become their undoing. Because in the shadow of their failures, sweeping floors and dusting corners, worked someone no one had considered. Someone with no resume worth boasting about, no expensive tools, no ego to inflate. And she would see the problem with the kind of clarity that only comes from looking with fresh, unburdened eyes. A cleaning lady. Clara Alvarez moved silently through the gleaming halls of Cole Dynamics Tower, her cart rattling softly with bottles of cleaner and stacks of rags. To most, she was as unremarkable as the furniture she dusted. Executives in sharp suits strode past her without a glance, their conversations heavy with numbers, mergers, and deadlines. To them, she was invisible, just another uniform, another background detail in the building's daily rhythm. But Clara noticed everything. At 52, life had not been kind to her. She was a widow, her husband taken too early by illness, leaving her with debts that seemed to multiply rather than shrink. Her children were grown but struggling, each trying to carve out a life in a world that seemed determined to grind the poor into dust. Clara worked nights and early mornings, piecing together 2 jobs to keep a roof over her head and food on her table. Cole Dynamics was her primary job, and though it was just cleaning to the executives, to Clara it was survival. The pay was steady, if modest, and the health insurance kept her from falling into the abyss of unpaid medical bills. She wore her Navy uniform proudly, even when others treated it like a mark of inferiority. Her daily routine was monotonous but strangely comforting. She scrubbed the marble floors until they gleamed, polished the glass walls that reflected the city skyline, and wiped down the conference tables where billion-dollar deals were signed. She emptied trash bins overflowing with half-finished ideas and discarded strategies. And as she moved, she listened. No one guarded their words around a cleaning lady. Executives argued in front of her, analysts muttered frustrations as they passed, and managers rehearsed presentations aloud without worrying about her presence. To them, she wasn't a person who might understand. She was a shadow, an extra in their corporate drama. Yet Clara's sharp mind caught details others missed. Numbers scribbled on discarded papers. Patterns in the way the staff whispered about the failing project. Even the CEO's silence as he passed her in the late hours spoke volumes. Despite the burden of her own struggles, Clara possessed a rare gift: clarity. She didn't have degrees or titles, but she had years of observing, adapting, and surviving. Life had taught her to solve problems with resourcefulness, to stretch pennies until they became dollars, and to see solutions in places others overlooked. She often joked to herself that running a household on minimum wage was harder than running a corporation. It just didn't come with applause. But no one at Cole Dynamics saw that. They saw only her bent shoulders, her worn shoes, her hands rough from bleach and scrubbing. Some treated her with polite indifference, nodding briefly as they passed. Others ignored her altogether, their eyes sliding past her as if she were part of the wallpaper. A few, emboldened by arrogance, spoke sharply when a trash bin wasn't emptied fast enough or a fingerprint smudge lingered on the glass. Clara endured it all in silence. She wasn't bitter. Not entirely. She had long ago accepted that people in power rarely noticed those who served them. Still, there were moments when the weight of invisibility pressed hard on her chest. As she wiped down the CEO's office late at night, she sometimes paused to look at the city skyline through his window, wondering how a life so full of possibility could feel so far from her own. What no one realized was that Clara, in her quiet invisibility, knew more about coal dynamics than most employees did. She saw the exhaustion in their faces, the frantic pacing in the halls, the way documents were shredded with unusual urgency. She noticed how the CEO stayed later and later, his jaw tight with frustration, his glass of whiskey untouched on the desk. She picked up the pieces, literally and figuratively, that others left behind. Symbolically, Clara was the opposite of the experts who had paraded through the building. Where they brought complexity, she embodied simplicity. Where they demanded attention, she faded into the background. Where they failed under pressure, she endured it every single day without complaint. She was a ghost in the halls of power, but a ghost with eyes wide open. And though no one yet knew it, the same sharp eyes that caught specks of dust on glass would soon catch the flaw that 20 experts had missed. The same hands that scrubbed floors would unravel the problem that millions of dollars couldn't fix. Clara Alvarez, the overlooked cleaning lady, was about to prove that being invisible didn't mean being powerless. The polished corridors of Coal Dynamics Tower had never felt so suffocating. For weeks, Ethan Cole had watched his empire bleed money, credibility, and time. Now, the crisis had reached a point where even he, the man who had built his fortune by conquering the impossible, was beginning to wonder if surrender was the only option left. The project, once hailed as the crown jewel of Coal Dynamics' future, now looked more like a noose tightening around his neck. Contracts worth hundreds of millions hung in limbo. Investors grew restless, their phone calls sharper by the day. Shareholders demanded answers Ethan no longer had. Every morning, he woke to another email warning him of collapsing confidence in the market, another article speculating that Coal Dynamics was finally faltering under his leadership. The boardroom, usually a place of respect and calculated discussion, had turned hostile. Board members who once praised his vision now questioned his judgment. 20 experts, Ethan, one member snapped during a heated meeting. 20. Do you realize what that headline looks like in tomorrow's papers? Another leaned forward, his voice sharp with accusation. We've thrown everything at this, and nothing has worked. Maybe it's time to admit the truth, that the project is a failure. Better to cut our losses now than drag this company into ruin with your pride. The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they echoed the doubts Ethan had buried deep inside himself. He sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his fingers steepled in front of him. His silence only deepened their frustration. Outside the boardroom, the tension was no secret. Whispers filled the halls. The employees who once held their heads high now avoided eye contact, afraid of being associated with the company's impending disaster. Then came the final blow, the news leak. A major outlet published an article with a damning headline, 20 experts fail at Coal Dynamics. Is Ethan Cole losing his touch? The story spread like wildfire, amplified by every competitor eager to see him stumble. Overnight, Ethan went from visionary leader to embattled CEO. His reputation, once unshakable, was cracking in real time. That night, the building was quiet, emptied of its usual energy. The executives had gone home, the board had dispersed, and even the bustling analysts had vanished into the city. Only the hum of the air conditioning and the glow of the skyline remained. Ethan sat alone in his office, his tie loosened, his eyes fixed on the darkened glass. On his desk sat a half-finished report, pages littered with notes from the 20th expert. Beside it, his glass of whiskey sat untouched, the ice melting into water. His reflection stared back at him from the window, a man who had everything yet felt hollow, who had solved problems for a lifetime yet now faced one he could not conquer. He considered the options laid out before him, each one a dagger to his pride. Shutting down the project would save money, but the humiliation would be permanent. Continuing would drain the company further, risking collapse. Either choice meant loss, and Ethan had never been a man who accepted losing. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of despair pressing against his chest. His empire, his reputation, his very identity, all of it threatened by a problem that refused to bend to wealth or intellect. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion clawing at him. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint squeak of wheels against tile. Clara Alvarez, with her cart and her mop, had begun her nightly rounds. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb him, though she noticed the slump of his shoulders, the way his usually sharp posture sagged under invisible weight. She had seen him late at night before, always commanding, always in control. But tonight, he looked different, tired, defeated. From the hallway, Clara lingered for a moment, her eyes soft with recognition. She had known that look before, on her late husband's face when the hospital bills piled too high, on her own face in the mirror when rent was due and her paycheck fell short. Desperation was not foreign to her, it was a language she understood fluently. Ethan didn't notice her at first, so absorbed in his private storm. But Clara, invisible as she often was, noticed him. She saw not the millionaire or the CEO, but a man on the edge of breaking. And though she would never have dared to believe it in that moment, her quiet presence, her simple act of noticing, was about to change everything. The following morning, Coal Dynamics Tower buzzed with tension. News of the latest expert's failure had spread like wildfire through the building. Executives whispered in corners, employees scrolled through the damning articles online, and the atmosphere felt thick with defeat. The once proud halls, where confidence used to echo, now carried only the sound of doubt. Ethan Cole strode into the boardroom with the weight of the world pressing against his shoulders. His sharp suit was immaculate, but the weariness in his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Around the long mahogany table, his senior staff sat stiffly, avoiding his gaze. No one wanted to be the one to admit what they all knew. They were out of options. Clara Alvarez pushed her cleaning cart down the hall outside, as she always did. She had grown used to the strained murmurs behind closed doors, the hurried footsteps of executives carrying files that meant millions. But today was different. She could feel it in the air, the heavy silence, the resignation. She paused briefly at the doorway, cloth in hand, her instincts telling her that the man inside was standing at the edge of something irreversible. Through the glass wall, she saw Ethan, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the back of a chair. He looked like a man drowning in an ocean no one else could see. Something in Clara stirred. She had watched this unfold for weeks, watched experts parade in with their arrogance and leave in defeat. She had overheard enough scraps of conversation to piece together the essence of the problem. And unlike the experts, she had seen it from a perspective no one else had considered. Her heart pounded. Who was she to speak? She was just the cleaning lady, a woman in a plain navy uniform whose work was to sweep floors, not solve billion-dollar crises. But she also knew what it meant to fight against impossible odds. She had solved problems every day of her life, keeping her family alive on scraps, fixing things with nothing but patience and creativity. Before she could talk herself out of it, Clara took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The heads of the executives swiveled toward her, irritation flashing across their faces. Interruptions were not tolerated here, especially not from someone in her position. One of them frowned. "This is a closed meeting." "I know," Clara said softly, her voice trembling. "But I think I might know what's wrong." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then came the scoffs. A ripple of laughter spread around the table, sharp and mocking. "You," one executive sneered. "A cleaning lady?" Another chuckled. "What's next? We asked the delivery man for financial advice?" Their derision cut like knives, but Clara didn't back down. Her hands gripped her rag tightly as she met Ethan's gaze. "I've been listening," she said quietly. "I've been watching. And I think I see something everyone else has missed." The laughter grew louder. A younger analyst smirked, shaking his head. "With all due respect, ma'am, 20 world-class experts couldn't figure this out. Do you really think you can? Clara swallowed hard, her cheeks burning with shame, but her eyes did not waver. Sometimes, she whispered, you can be too close to something to see it clearly. Sometimes the answer isn't complicated. Sometimes it's simple. The room grew restless, executives shifting in their seats, eager to dismiss her and move on. But Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He studied her, his sharp eyes narrowing as though weighing the courage it had taken to speak. Everyone else has failed, Ethan said slowly, his voice cutting through the noise. Every so-called genius I've paid has walked out of here with excuses. And now my company is bleeding because of it. He paused, his gaze still locked on Clara. So why not? Why not let her try? The room erupted in protest. Sir, this is absurd. She'll make a fool of us. This isn't a charity experiment. Ethan raised a hand, silencing them. Enough. His tone brooked no argument. If 20 experts can fail, then perhaps the problem isn't in who we choose, but how we choose. If she believes she sees something, we'll hear it. Clara's pulse raced. She had expected to be thrown out, humiliated further. Instead, the most powerful man in the building was giving her a chance. The executives stared at him in disbelief, but none dared challenge him again. Ethan stepped back, gesturing to the array of screens and documents spread across the table. His voice was calm but edged with curiosity. All right, Clara, he said. Show us. The room went silent. For the first time, the laughter died, replaced by a thick, electric tension. All eyes turned to Clara, the cleaning lady who had dared to speak where no one else would. And in that silence, she took a single step forward, her hands trembling but her mind clear. What happened next would defy every expectation in the room. The boardroom had never felt so still. The polished table gleamed under the overhead lights, a battlefield where 20 experts had already fallen. Laptops glowed with complex models, diagrams littered the screens, and thick binders filled with calculations lay scattered. Millions of dollars had been poured into theories that went nowhere. And now, a cleaning lady stood in the middle of it all. Clara's palms were damp, but her voice, though soft, carried a steadiness that surprised even her. May I see the reports? She asked. An executive snorted. What is she going to do? Dust them off? The remark earned a few chuckles, but Ethan Cole silenced the mockery with a single glare. He slid one of the thick binders across the table toward her. Go on, he said, his tone unreadable. Clara took the binder, her fingers brushing over the heavy leather cover. She flipped it open, her eyes skimming the complex graphs and endless streams of data. She didn't pretend to understand the advanced equations. But unlike the others, she wasn't trying to prove brilliance. She was looking for something else, something obvious. She traced a line on one of the charts, frowning slightly. Then she glanced at another document, comparing them. The room waited impatiently, executives exchanging smug looks as though they expected her to fold under the weight of numbers. But Clara's brow smoothed. Her lips parted just slightly. This, she murmured, pointing at a simple figure buried in the report. It's wrong. The room froze. What? One of the analysts demanded. This input, Clara said, her voice firmer now. She pointed again, her finger steady. It doesn't match the data on the shipment logs I've been cleaning up every night. The executives blinked, confused. Ethan leaned forward. Explain, he urged. Clara inhaled slowly, choosing her words. Every evening, I empty the trash in the logistics office. They throw away drafts of their reports. I've seen the numbers they cross out and rewrite. And this number, she tapped it again, doesn't match the corrected versions I've seen. It's been copied wrong from the start. Every calculation after that is built on a mistake. The silence that followed was deafening. The smug smiles slipped from the executives' faces, replaced by dawning realization. One analyst scrambled to pull up the original shipment logs. His fingers shook as he typed, the screen blinking to life. Seconds later, The truth glared back at them in cold, undeniable digits. She was right. The error was glaring in its simplicity, a single misreported figure. One wrong number, carried forward into every model, every theory, every solution that 20 experts had built upon. A ripple of disbelief spread across the table. The IT specialist who had charged $500,000 for his consultancy turned pale. The mathematician who had written formulas spanning pages sank back in his chair. They had all been defeated by something so small a janitor's glance could unravel it. Impossible, one of them muttered, but the evidence glowed on the screen. It was undeniable. Clara looked down at the table, embarrassed by the weight of their stares. It's just paying attention, she said quietly. Ethan Cole rose slowly to his feet. His eyes, usually so guarded, were alight with something rare, astonishment. He walked around the table, the soles of his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor, until he stood directly before her. "How long?" he asked softly. "How long did it take you to see it?" Clara hesitated, then answered honestly. "About a minute." The words hit the room like thunder. A minute. 1 minute from a woman no one had thought capable of anything more than scrubbing floors, and she had solved the problem that millions of dollars and 20 celebrated minds couldn't. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, and for the first time in weeks, the crushing pressure on his chest eased. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and gave a short, incredulous laugh. 1 minute, he repeated, shaking his head. All this time, and it took 1 minute. Around the table, shame and humiliation burned on the experts' faces. They shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Clara's gaze. The executives, too, were stunned into silence, their arrogance shattered. Ethan turned to them, his voice sharp. "Let this be a lesson. Wisdom doesn't wear a title. It doesn't come with a degree. Sometimes the answers we spend fortunes chasing are right in front of us, waiting for someone humble enough to see them." No one dared reply. Clara, her cheeks flushing, tried to retreat, mumbling, "I should get back to work," but Ethan stopped her with a raised hand. "Not yet," he said. His tone held authority, but also something else, respect. "Today, the cleaning lady saved this company." The boardroom, once filled with laughter at her expense, now stood in reverent silence. Clara Alvarez, invisible to them for so long, had just changed the course of coal dynamics with nothing more than observation, patience, and courage. And as Ethan looked at her, admiration flickered in his eyes. She had done the impossible, and she had done it without fanfare. It wasn't just a solution. It was a miracle. The 1-minute miracle. For a long, breathless moment after Clara spoke, no one moved. The glow of the digital display with its corrected numbers cast an almost accusatory light on the faces around the boardroom table. The silence was heavy, oppressive, shattered only by a faint whisper that traveled across the room like wind through broken glass. "She's right," an analyst murmured, voice tinged with disbelief. That whisper was enough to ignite the storm. One of the engineers slammed his pen down. "This is ridiculous. Are we seriously saying the entire operation collapsed because of a clerical error? And that a cleaning lady found it?" His tone dripped with indignation, as though the very idea insulted his years of training. Another expert adjusted his glasses nervously. "It wasn't luck. She spotted something we didn't. That takes clarity of mind." His words carried a reluctant respect, though his voice was barely audible. Embarrassment colored the faces of many. The mathematician who had filled whiteboards with formulas muttered under his breath, "Months of work, millions wasted, undone by one wrong digit." Clara shifted uncomfortably, wishing the polished floor beneath her would swallow her whole. The weight of their stares felt unbearable. She hadn't meant to humiliate anyone, she had only pointed out what she'd noticed. And yet, in a single breath, she had appended the hierarchy that governed this place. Employees who had been standing along the walls leaned closer to one another, whispering furiously. "Did you see that? She's just a cleaner." "No, she's more than that." The hushed voices rippled like aftershocks. For the first time, Clara's presence was not invisible. She was the center of every gaze, the name on every lip. But recognition came with backlash. She was just lucky, one consultant snapped, his pride refusing to surrender. Anyone could have stumbled on that mistake if they had access to the logs she claims to have seen. Yet none of you did. Ethan Cole's voice cut across the room like a blade. The CEO had been silent until now, observing the storm brew, watching Clara shrink under the pressure. But now his presence commanded the space, drawing every eye to him. He stood tall, his jaw firm, his gaze unyielding. She succeeded where you all failed, Ethan continued. You had the tools, the data, the degrees, and the reputations. She had none of those. Yet it was her eyes, her patience, and her courage to speak up that saved us. The words landed like hammer blows. Some flushed with shame, others with indignation. But none dared challenge him outright. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The man who had once seemed so untouchable, so unreachable, was now standing between her and the scorn of the room. For the first time since her husband's passing, she felt as though someone truly saw her, not as invisible labor, but as a human being with worth. Ethan turned to her then, his voice softer but carrying just as much weight. You're not invisible, Clara. Not anymore. The words stunned her. She lowered her eyes, unable to meet his gaze, but a warmth spread through her chest. It was the turning point she hadn't dared dream of, the moment she transformed from a shadow in the hallways to someone whose voice mattered. The room remained tense, but the balance had shifted. The experts who once sat like giants now looked small, their egos pierced. And Clara, who had carried her mop and bucket through those halls unnoticed for years, stood taller than them all, not by posture, but by truth. In that moment, hierarchy cracked. Respect, once reserved for the powerful and the wealthy, bent toward the woman who had seen what no one else would. And the whispers of employees grew louder, no longer contemptuous but filled with awe. The cleaning lady saved us. The cleaning lady. The phrase spread like a spark through dry grass, unstoppable. Clara Alvarez was invisible no longer. Ethan Cole sat in his glass-walled office, the skyline of the city glittering beyond like a field of stars. Yet despite the view, his mind was not on profits or contracts. It was on Clara, the cleaning lady who had just done what 20 experts could not. The boardroom incident still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The humiliation of the experts, the whispers of employees, and Clara's quiet voice correcting the mistake replayed in his mind. But now came the difficult part, the part no one wanted to say out loud. What would he do with her? On his desk lay 2 stacks of papers. One was a preliminary report drafted by the board secretary, already omitting Clara's name, instead crediting internal review for identifying the error. The other stack was a blank page, awaiting Ethan's decision. He knew the board's expectations. They were businessmen to the core. To them, Clara was a nobody, a cleaner who happened to get lucky. Her role would be erased in the official records. They would protect the company's reputation, preserve the expert's fragile pride, and move on. To give her public recognition, or worse, a reward, would be unthinkable. The board members had been clear after the meeting. Ethan, let's not make a spectacle of this. She's a cleaning lady, not an engineer. Rewarding her would set a bad precedent. What next? Janitors telling us how to run the company. Their words had carried a sneer, an assumption that Ethan would, of course, agree. But Ethan did not agree. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Clara's face came to mind. The way she had spoken with quiet certainty, the way she had looked ready to retreat under the weight of scorn until he defended her. She hadn't asked for recognition or money. She hadn't even wanted the spotlight. She had spoken up because it was right. And that made his choice more difficult. If he followed the board's advice, he would keep the peace. Investors wouldn't ask awkward questions. The experts wouldn't storm out in protest. Clara would slip back into obscurity, and life at the company would go on as if nothing had happened. But he knew the truth. The company would owe its survival to a woman scrubbing floors. The conflict gnawed at him. Was he a man of image or of integrity? That night, Ethan called for a private meeting with the board. The room was tense before he even entered. Some members were already whispering about the headlines, fearful of public exposure. He didn't waste time. "She saved us," Ethan said simply, standing at the head of the table. "Clara Alvarez prevented a catastrophe. Without her, we would be facing losses in the billions and possible lawsuits." The chairman of the board adjusted his cufflinks with irritation. "We acknowledge her contribution. But surely you don't mean to elevate her. It would be embarrassing." "Embarrassing?" Ethan's tone sharpened. "What's embarrassing is that 20 experts with years of training and a combined billing of millions failed. What's embarrassing is that we ignored her because of her title. What's embarrassing is that the truth frightens you more than the mistake itself." The words hit hard. A murmur ran through the room, but no one spoke up to contradict him. Ethan's voice lowered, heavy with conviction. "We're at a crossroads. We can bury her name and pretend nothing happened, or we can acknowledge her openly. One path is easy. The other is right." The board bristled. Some shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable with the weight of his words. They had built their careers on protecting image and power. Clara's recognition threatened to unravel that hierarchy. But Ethan was resolute. "If we exploit her idea and dismiss her contribution, we betray everything we claim to stand for. Innovation, merit, integrity, those words mean nothing if we trample the very person who lived them." For a long time, silence filled the room. The decision was his to make, and everyone knew it. At last, the chairman sighed, his voice begrudging. "Very well, Ethan. Do what you think is best. But know this, if you reward her, you'll be opening a door we may not be able to close." Ethan didn't flinch. "Good. Then let it stay open." When the meeting ended, Ethan returned to his office. The city lights still sparkled, but they no longer distracted him. He picked up the blank page on his desk and began to write. It was a press release, one that credited Clara Alvarez by name for saving the company. Not a ghost in the background. Not a footnote erased by power. But the very heart of the story. And as his pen scratched across the paper, Ethan knew this moment was more than a business decision. It was a test of his own character, and for once, money had nothing to do with it. The boardroom was filled again, but this time the air was different. Gone were the whispers of doubt and scorn that had followed Clara after her discovery. Instead, anticipation crackled across the long mahogany table as executives, analysts, and advisors sat upright, waiting for Ethan Cole to speak. At the far corner of the room, Clara Alvarez sat stiffly in a chair, not at the cleaning cart she usually pushed, but at the actual meeting table. Her hands trembled on her lap, her plain uniform ironed carefully that morning. She hadn't wanted to come. She had tried to refuse the invitation, but Ethan had been insistent. "You belong here," he had told her. And now, here she was, staring at a polished surface that reflected back a woman she barely recognized. Ethan stood at the head of the table. His tall figure usually carried the aura of authority, a man who commanded empires and bent markets to his will. But today, there was a softness in his posture, a vulnerability no one in the company had ever seen before. He looked straight at Clara before addressing the room. "Today, we acknowledge someone who saved this company." A ripple went through the executives. Many darted nervous glances at one another, unsure of where this was headed. Ethan's voice grew steadier. 20 experts. Millions spent. Weeks of failure. And yet, the person who solved it was not one of them. It was not me. It was not anyone you'd expect. It was her. He gestured toward Clara. Dozens of eyes turned to her. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks flushing. "This woman," Ethan continued, "saw what no one else could. Not because of a degree or a title, but because of clarity, humility, and the courage to speak when the room told her to be silent." The room fell into stunned quiet. No one moved. Even the arrogant engineers who had once scoffed at her lowered their gaze. Ethan's next words broke that silence like a hammer. She is no longer invisible. From today, Clara Alvarez is recognized as a contributor to this project's success. And she will be rewarded accordingly. Murmurs rose immediately. Some with approval, others with discontent. But Ethan pressed forward. Effective immediately, he announced, her debts will be cleared. The company will pay off the loans that burden her. In addition, she will receive a financial bonus equal to what we pay an external consultant of her caliber, had we listened to one who actually solved the problem. Clara's eyes widened. Her lips parted as though to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Tears pooled at the corners of her eyes. And one more thing, Ethan added. His tone softened, almost warm. From now on, she will not walk these halls as someone invisible. Clara will take on an official role as my advisor. Yes, advisor. Her perspective has proven more valuable than the noise of egos and theories. And I want her voice at this table. A gasp rippled through the room. An advisor? For a cleaning lady? The audacity stunned them. Yet no one dared challenge Ethan openly. Clara finally found her voice, though it shook. Mr. Cole, I don't know what to say. I don't deserve this. Ethan shook his head. You deserve far more than you think. You carried a wisdom we all overlooked. And if we're honest, we owe you more than money. We owe you our survival. Her tears spilled freely now. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. For years she had worked in silence, ignored, underestimated, dismissed. She had scrubbed floors that echoed with the laughter of the powerful, and now those same halls bore witness to her recognition. Around the table, some executives shifted with unease. But others, junior staff, analysts, and even a few senior members, watched with admiration. For the first time, they saw a CEO bow to humility instead of pride. Ethan did something no one expected. He turned away from the head of the table and walked toward Clara. The mighty millionaire lowered himself, crouching slightly beside her chair so he could meet her eyes directly. "Thank you, Clara," he said, quietly but firmly. "You saved us all." Her sob broke the tension like a thunderclap. She covered her face with both hands, overcome by emotion. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a cleaner, not as a shadow, but as a person. The sight silenced every whisper. In that moment, the hierarchy cracked. Power and status faded. All that remained was gratitude between a millionaire and a woman who had lived her life invisible. When Clara finally lowered her hands, Ethan offered his. She hesitated, then took it. He helped her to her feet, and for the first time in her life, Clara Alvarez stood tall in the boardroom of the empire she had quietly served. And the audience, the executives, the staff, the doubters, saw not just a humble cleaning lady, but the woman who had done what brilliance, money, and power could not. The news of what had happened in the boardroom traveled faster than any official memo. By the following morning, whispers of Clara's one-minute miracle had reached every floor of Cole Dynamics. 4 years, she had moved unseen through those halls, her cart squeaking softly as she polished glass doors and wiped down marble floors. People had passed her as though she were a fixture of the building, barely nodding, often not even looking up. But now, those same people paused when they saw her. "Good morning, Ms. Alvarez," a receptionist greeted her, smiling nervously. Clara froze mid-step, unused to the acknowledgement. "Oh, just Clara," she replied softly. But the woman shook her head. "No, ma'am. You deserve respect." By lunchtime, the ripple had grown stronger. Junior staff who once giggled at her uniform now asked if they could sit with her in the cafeteria. Even some of the experts, brilliant minds whose egos had been bruised by her sharp observation, approached her, hesitant but sincere. One engineer lingered by her table, shifting awkwardly with his tray. "I wanted to ask how you saw it," he admitted. "The flaw. We all looked at it, but you caught it instantly." Clara set down her spoon, considering. Sometimes you stare so hard at a wall that you miss the open door right beside it, she said gently. I just saw the door. The man blinked, then laughed quietly, humbled. Maybe I've been staring too long at walls. Others sought her not just for answers but for perspective. They wanted to understand how someone without advanced degrees or technical training had spotted what they had missed. And though many were too proud to say it aloud, they admired her clarity more than they envied it. Across the company, Clara's story became a symbol. In the break rooms, employees debated what it meant. Shows you don't need a title to have a brain, one said. Or that dignity doesn't come from your paycheck, another added. It was as though her presence had cracked open a hidden truth. Intelligence lived in every corner, not only behind office doors with gold nameplates. For Clara, the change felt surreal. She was still the same woman, still pushing her cart, still cleaning smudges from windows. But the way people looked at her had transformed. They no longer saw through her. They saw her. One afternoon, as she polished the conference room table, a young intern entered with a stack of files. He stopped short, staring at her with awe. You're the lady who fixed the project, right? He asked. Clara smiled faintly. I just noticed something others missed. The boy's eyes shone. My mom's a cleaner too. She thinks no one respects her. I can't wait to tell her about you. That moment pierced Clara's heart more deeply than any applause. It wasn't about her reputation or reward, it was about what her story meant for others like her. People who lived their lives overlooked, dismissed, treated as invisible. Meanwhile, in the upper echelons of the company, the shift was more complicated. Some executives bristled at the idea that a cleaning lady's insight had overshadowed their expertise. But Ethan's unwavering defense of her left them little room to sneer. If the CEO himself respected her, then openly dismissing her would only make them look small. And so, grudgingly at first, they too began to acknowledge her. What started as stiff nods became genuine greetings. Soon, even those who once scoffed at her began to treat her with cautious admiration. Clara, ever humble, tried to carry herself the same way she always had. She didn't demand deference or change her tone. She still worked hard, still listened more than she spoke. But inside, something subtle had shifted. For the first time in years, she felt dignity not as something she had to cling to, but as something others granted freely. Her invisibility was gone. In its place stood respect, not for her status, but for her humanity. And through the ripple of whispers and stories, Clara Alvarez became more than the cleaning lady. She became the reminder that brilliance can bloom in the most ordinary soil, and that no one, no matter how humble their role, should ever be unseen. It began with a single leak. Someone inside Coal Dynamics, unable to resist the temptation of a sensational story, whispered to a journalist, "The cleaning lady solved it. Not the experts. The cleaning lady." By the next morning, headlines blazed across major outlets. Cleaning lady outsmarts 20 experts, saves billion-dollar project. Humility wins, how a janitor solved what engineers couldn't. Ethan Cole's gamble pays off, a CEO who listened. Clara Alvarez's name was everywhere. For a woman who had lived her entire adult life in quiet obscurity, the sudden glare of attention felt surreal. Television trucks lined the street outside her modest apartment. Strangers left flowers by her door. Neighbors she had known for years now treated her as though she were royalty. At Coal Dynamics, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters camped at the company's gates, demanding statements. Cameras flashed as Ethan Cole emerged from his black sedan, smiling faintly but carrying himself with a confidence he hadn't displayed in months. For the first time since the crisis began, he was no longer the embattled CEO with a failing project. He was the man who had the humility to listen to a cleaning lady. "Mr. Cole, is it true she solved the problem in less than a minute?" one journalist shouted. "It is," Ethan replied without hesitation. "And we should all be grateful she did." His words spread like wildfire. Editorials praised him for his decision to acknowledge Clara's brilliance instead of burying it. In a corporate world defined by ego and hierarchy, one opinion piece declared, Coal Dynamics has shown what leadership truly looks like. Ethan's reputation, once teetering on the edge of ruin, now soared. But the real star of the story was Clara. Clips of her walking timidly through the glass halls of the company, head bowed, clutching her cleaning supplies, were replayed endlessly, each time with dramatic narration about how she had humbled the world's brightest minds. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag wisdom in humility. Hashtag Clara the cleaner. Hashtag respect all roles. Memes compared her to superheroes, cartoons depicted her sweeping away problems, and countless posts hailed her as a symbol of hope. "You're living proof that you don't need a degree to have wisdom," one Twitter user wrote. "She's my hero," another posted, with a photo of their own mother in a janitor's uniform. For Clara, it was overwhelming. She had never asked for fame. She still lived in the same small apartment, still stretched every paycheck to cover groceries and rent. Yet, now when she went to the market, people whispered her name in awe. Some even stopped her to ask for advice, as though she had unlocked some universal secret. Her humility shone through every encounter. When reporters cornered her outside her building, asking how it felt to outsmart experts, she simply replied, "I don't think I outsmarted anyone. I just looked at the problem with fresh eyes." Sometimes, simplicity speaks louder than complexity. That line was replayed on television for days. It struck a chord with millions who were tired of being overlooked in their own jobs and lives. To them, Clara wasn't just a woman with a sharp mind, she was proof that ordinary people mattered. Back at the company, the impact was just as profound. Employees who once barely noticed her now defended her fiercely. One engineer told a journalist, "She saw what we didn't. That doesn't make her less than us, it makes her exactly what this company needed." Even the board members, who had once doubted Ethan's judgment, publicly praised the decision to let Clara try. Their tune had changed, not only because the project was saved, but because the world was watching. In every corner of society, Clara's story sparked conversations. About class, about respect, about the overlooked intelligence in ordinary roles. Schools held assemblies discussing her example. Talk shows debated whether corporations undervalued simple wisdom. Parents told their children about her, teaching them never to look down on anyone. And through it all, Clara remained the same. She still polished the marble floors at Coal Dynamics, still carried her cart through the glittering halls. But now, when she moved past executives, they nodded with genuine respect. Some even stepped aside to give her space. Her invisibility had vanished forever. The world had seen her, and in seeing her, they saw something far greater. The quiet truth that brilliance can reside in the most humble of hands. For Clara Alvarez, life no longer looked like the endless uphill struggle it had once been. The constant weight of overdue bills and the gnawing fear of not making rent had eased. Ethan's reward, a financial bonus that cleared her debts, along with a new position that valued her insight, gave her the first taste of stability she had known since her husband's passing. She could finally buy groceries without counting every coin, could walk into her modest apartment without the shadow of anxiety trailing her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was living, not just surviving. But the real change wasn't just in her bank account. It was in the way people treated her. The executives who once brushed past her in the hall now greeted her with warm respect. Employees who had never spoken to her before asked for her opinion on small decisions, not out of mockery, but out of genuine admiration. Even beyond the walls of Coal Dynamics, her story had given her a kind of recognition she never sought but deeply appreciated. She was no longer invisible. She was Clara, the woman who solved what no one else could. And yet, Clara remained grounded. She still preferred simple clothes, still walked to work most mornings instead of taking the sleek car Ethan had offered to send. She had no interest in extravagance. What she cherished most was dignity, the dignity of being seen, of being valued. Ethan, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation of his own. The crisis that had nearly shattered his company ended up reshaping him instead. For years, he had operated from a place of pride and hierarchy. His world was one of polished boardrooms, towering egos, and relentless competition. Status had been his compass. But Clara's unexpected brilliance shattered those assumptions. He began noticing people in ways he never had before: the receptionist who greeted him every morning, the cafeteria worker who served meals, the security guard who stood at the lobby doors in the dead of night. They were no longer background figures in his empire. They were people, each with their own stories, their own quiet wisdom. Clara had taught him that genius wasn't confined to resumes or titles. Sometimes, it wore a cleaning uniform and carried a mop bucket. Their paths, once worlds apart, now crossed often, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Ethan would stop by her office, a small, sunlit space he had personally arranged for her, to ask how she was doing. Sometimes, he sought her perspective on decisions. Other times, they simply shared quiet conversations about life, loss, and resilience. Clara spoke to him without fear, and in her honesty, Ethan found the kind of grounding he had long lost in the ruthless world of business. Their friendship was unusual by every measure: an orphaned cleaning lady and a billionaire CEO, but it was real. Built not on power or need, but on mutual respect and gratitude. Ethan admired her humility. Clara respected his willingness to change. In the end, it wasn't just Clara's life that transformed. Ethan's did too. He became a leader less defined by wealth and authority, and more by empathy and humanity. And Clara, once invisible in the halls of power, became a quiet beacon of what was possible when people dared to look beyond status. Together, they proved a simple truth: sometimes, the most extraordinary transformations begin with the smallest act of being heard. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of the cleaning lady who solved the impossible became more than just a headline. It grew into a parable, told in boardrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables. Some repeated it as a business lesson, others as an inspiration about humility, but at its heart, it was a reminder of something timeless. Sometimes, the simplest mind sees what the most educated miss. Clara Alvarez, however, did not let the sudden fame sweep her away. She continued working with the same quiet dignity she always had. Though her title had changed and her financial worries had lifted, she still carried herself with the humility of someone who knew what it was like to be unseen. She greeted the janitors, shared lunches with the receptionists, and never forgot the feeling of being invisible in the very building where she now commanded respect. Recognition had elevated her, yes, but it had not changed her soul. Ethan Cole, on the other hand, had undergone a visible transformation. Once a man consumed by figures, deadlines, and status, he now carried with him a different kind of presence. He no longer saw people as positions on an organizational chart, but as individuals with value, no matter their role. In meetings, he often reminded his executives, "Remember Clara. Never underestimate the eyes that watch quietly from the corners." It was not just a story he told to inspire them, it was a standard he now lived by. Reporters frequently asked Ethan what had changed the most about him since that crisis. He always answered the same way: "I learned that leadership is not about knowing everything yourself, but about recognizing value in everyone around you. Clara taught me that." It humbled him to give credit so openly, but he did so gladly, for he understood that true greatness is not diminished by sharing it. Clara, for her part, sometimes found herself overwhelmed by the attention her story continued to receive. Letters came in from strangers, single mothers who said her story gave them hope, struggling workers who felt seen because of her. Teachers requested to share her story with students as a lesson in humility and perseverance. And though the praise felt heavy at times, Clara carried it with quiet grace. She always responded with the same line: "I'm just someone who did her job and paid attention. Nothing more, nothing less." Yet, in those few words, she revealed the true lesson. Extraordinary value doesn't always wear the clothes of prestige. It doesn't always sit in corner offices or hold advanced degrees. Sometimes, it comes from the people we least expect, the ones society overlooks, the ones who walk quietly with wisdom untapped. Ethan's company would go on to thrive, stronger than ever, but he often reflected that the real success wasn't financial. It was cultural. The respect that had blossomed after Clara's breakthrough reshaped the way his employees treated one another. Hierarchies softened, collaboration deepened, and small voices found space to speak. It was a subtle revolution, born not of policy, but of perspective. Years later, When Ethan was asked to deliver a keynote speech about leadership, he closed with words that echoed the heart of the lesson. Every life, no matter how humble, holds extraordinary value. A leader's greatest task is not to shine the brightest, but to notice the hidden light in others, and to give it the chance to glow. Clara sat in the audience that day, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes glistening. She didn't crave recognition, but she was grateful that her small act of courage had changed not only her life, but the lives of countless others. And as she rose to her feet with the crowd's applause, she thought to herself, perhaps the truest miracles are the ones that remind us to see one another clearly.